Lord Stevenson asked about the evidential position in relation to the Hubbard deflator.
Yeah.
And I just want to make a couple of points about that and go back to the judgment which Your Lordship was looking at.
Yes.
The first point to make is that the judge obviously had all the evidence before him from Mr. Hubbard, from
Yes.
Professor Hubbard and Mr. Davies, and he rejected the Hubbard deflator. In paragraph 243 of the judgment, which is at page 146 in the core bundle, you see that he rejects the Hubbard deflator. The Hubbard deflator construction requires the words in constant 1993 prices to be crossed out and replaced. And you see that?
Yes.
And so what we say that does is that reflects the use, that he accepted the use of the words of constant prices in the contract, clearly used to mean real GDP.
Yes, I understand
defined,
that.
and also reflects the fact that that the Hubbard number is not in constant 1993 prices and not what the contract specifies. And that ties in with the part in Mr. Davis's report that I took you to earlier, which is paragraph 81D and F, where Mr. Davies sets out and recites the SNA language, and we can turn that up. It's at page 286. Your Lordship will remember that. And it's not Mr. Davis's definition, it's the definition from the SNA, if you want to turn that up. It's at 286, it's paragraph 81D.
Sorry, which bundle? In the core supplement?
It's in the core supplementary bundle. And you can see at D and F precisely what is set out from paragraph 1598 of the 2008 SNA. And also look at F, please. So that is what the judge has before him when he reaches the conclusion in that paragraph at 243. Going back into the judgment at 244, he notes that it is not disputed that the Hubbard deflator approach does not, in fact, hold the 1993 prices of goods and services, the price configuration, constant, but replaces the price configuration and services based on their prices in 93 with the price configuration of goods and services based on their prices in 2014.
Yeah.
And that finding, we say, reflects the evidence, which was not in dispute, because that's Mr. Davis's point, and your Lordship picked that up, that you have different baskets of goods and services, and you simply can't port 1993 prices onto a 2004 scope. And then going on into the judgment at 245, which is the third point he makes, it's also, we say, tied in with Mr. Davis's evidence, which is the point on multiple rebasings, which is based on which Mr. David said about his deflator, and Mr. Hubbard's evidence that you need to take two steps. And I'm going to come on to that in a minute. So we say it's implicit in those three paragraphs of the judgment that the learned judge accepted Mr. Davis's analysis.
Yeah.
There's no suggestion at all in the judgment that he wasn't accepting Mr. Davis's analysis. Mr. Railton needs to say either the judge found Mr. Davies to be wrong, or this court should substitute its own findings to the effect that Mr. Davies is wrong. I just want to show you one other paragraph in the judgment. It comes up in relation to quantum. I'm not sure your Lordship has been referred to it today or yesterday. It's 255. And because Professor Hubbard's report was really in relation to quantum, that's why one finds it here. The judge's finding from where it says, as Miss Praveen Casey put it, the Hubbard deflated figure will never be an accurate proxy for index 93 year base prices real figure, because as discussed, it starts from a different scope or base and does not hold constant the 93 configuration.
Yeah.
So again, he's saying, and it shows that the judge is agreeing with the essence of what Mr. Davis said.
Yes, and I see
Now-
that he says at 256 that he's satisfied that
Yeah.
Davis's approach is
Absolutely.
appropriate.
And then, my lord, going to the cross-examination, just to give you the references and a couple of excerpts from that. That is in supplemental bundle 4. It's in tab 62. It's at page, starts, the relevant part is at page 73, bottom right-hand corner, internal page 25. Now, I have to accept there was a lot of back and forth with Professor Hubbard. He wasn't an easy man to cross-examine. But I just want to highlight a few findings from a few passages from that. The first one I'd ask you to look at is internal page 29, and read to yourselves, please, from lines 14 to internal page 30, line 25. And what's clear from that passage with respect is that that Mr. Hubbard is using a 2004 basis, and that it wasn't the same as the prices wouldn't be the same as the index would have produced using 1993 constant prices.
Yeah.
And again, the further point is made in internal 41, so it's page 77. If your lordship, my lady, would read from lines 5 to 20, when the learned judge intervenes and asks a question.
Page 41.
41 internally, it's page 77, bottom right-hand corner, lines 5 to 20. And then there is a longer passage, internal page 43, from line 3, where I'm cross-examining him about the SNA, which is in Mr. Davis's evidence, and going, if you could read 43, 44, and to line 7 on 45, please.
Yeah.
And what we say you get from that is he at least accepted that that is what the SNA said. And what he said to the judge was, well, by reference to some other source, one could have taken a different view. And the question one asked oneself was the judge obliged to accept Professor Hubbard's assertion that one could define it in some other way using a different source, or was the learned judge entitled to find that constant prices has the meaning in the SNA, which Hubbard describes as absolutism, but the judge doesn't say, and he doesn't say, Professor Hubbard is wrong. And so standing back again, is the judge obliged to accept that one has to, what Hubbard says is right, and that what the SNA and Mr. Davis must said was wrong, and we say that is what Mr. Railton has to persuade you of. And that does, as I said, take you back, and you've looked at it, to paragraphs 81D and F of Davies, which makes very clear. And we say the judge was entitled to follow that, and did, by concluding that we were talking about constant prices.
Yes. Well, I think I've got your answer. Your answer is a judge implicitly accepting what Mr. Davies said.
Yes, absolutely. I do wish to remind your lordship and your ladyship about the definitions in the securities in the core bundle 2 in tab 15. And can I just make this as a final point on this point? If you go to the definition, please, of actual real GDP, which is on page 35, we looked at it yesterday, it means for any reference year, GDP measured in constant prices for the year of base prices. So as I said earlier, if hypothetically 1993 is your year of base prices, you fill in the blank with 1993, so actual real GDP means GDP measured in constant prices for 93. You look at the base case table over the page, and it says in millions of constant 1993 pesos, i.e. constant 1993 prices, and we know that the number, which has to be compared like for like with actual real GDP under the level condition, is also a real GDP number, assuming 93 scope and 93 prices. So on our case, the term constant prices of a year is being given the same meaning in each of the definitions and in the adjustment provision, whereas on the Republic's case, constant prices of 1993 is being given one meaning in the definitions and a different meaning in the adjustment provision, and that, with respect, can't be right. So where I want to go next, if I may, is to this issue about multiple rebasing. And that is at paragraph 82 of our skeleton. And it identifies a fifth problem that the learned judge picked up. If you can look at 82, please. And this is our old friend, the multiple rebasing issue. Now, the short point is the Republic's deflation approach, as pleaded, and you saw that earlier today, is premised on there being a single IPD deflator between the newest year of base prices and 1993 prices. And that's in the pleading, as the reference is 248 in the core bundle. It says the index published deflator from 1993 to the new year of base prices. But on the Republic's approach, and I mentioned this before lunch, the deflator won't necessarily exist after a second or subsequent rebasing, because on their case, the 1993 year of base prices ceases to be published. So, for example, if you rebase in 2023 to 2017, the year of base prices, there won't be an IPD between the 2017 series and the 1993 series.
But why are we assuming their case that 1993 won't be published? Because this is an alternative argument based on you being right on your main construction point.
Well, it's a
which does
main
involve
construction, but their primary submission is that the 1993 data is not going to be, their alternative assumes it's not going to be published either.
Why do you say that?
Because they have worked out a deflator, but it doesn't assume constant publication.
In fact, it avoids it.
Yes, I see. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah.
I mean, we wouldn't be in that territory otherwise. So, and this goes to the point, in fact, that your lordship raised 2 days ago. It's at transcript page day 2, page 78. You were correct when you said to Mr. Railton, you can derive a deflator, for example, between 1993 and 2004, although the securities don't specify the precise method of doing so. But following subsequent rebasings, you can't do that. And Professor Hubbard agreed with that. He accepted in cross-examination that there would be no deflator from 2017 back to 1993. I'm just going to find that I wrote down the reference for that. Let me see, sorry if I can find my note of what I wrote it down in the cross-examination, because he accepted that there would be a two-step process. So,
Yes, you showed us that yesterday, I think.
sorry.
You showed us that yesterday, I
Yes.
think, the two-step process,
So-
and you explained that mixed two different baskets, one at each different step.
But this is about the point that you'd need another deflator. And as I said, it's not something that the securities provide for at all. It's not something that the Republic has pleaded. The pleading assumes, the reason why I showed that to you this morning, the pleading assumes a single IPD. So they don't tell you how that second step works. So sitting here today, we can't be sure. And like much of this, there may be many ways of doing it. And Mr. Railton, I think yesterday accepted that there would be a two-step process. And this is the specific point made at paragraph 245 of my the learned judge's judgment. If you look at 245 on page 146, this is the point the learned judge makes. And the cross-examination point I was grappling to find, it was in the supplemental bundle 4, it's at page 79 of the Hubbard cross-examination, internal page 49, just for your note. So the bottom line is, to find in the Republic's favour on this point, you need to rewrite the adjustment provision clause even more than the Republic's current pleading does, because in addition to specifying the index published IPD, which isn't identified in the securities, you need to yet specify a further method that is not pleaded and it's not put forward in any evidence for when there is no such IPD. And of course, you can't do that on the wording of the securities. It wasn't anticipated. Now, the final point we need to make is at paragraph 83 of our skeleton. And it's on the economics. And your lordship asked yesterday whether, of Mr. Railton, whether Professor Boiter gave some evidence on this, and he did. I'm going to go to that in a moment. But the key point is that both experts agreed that this is just another form of a fixed fraction, the Hubbard deflator. And Dr. Borenstein explained, and it's quoted in the skeleton, what it does is produce a fixed fraction, which is different from the Republic's primary case. It's 1.6 rather than 1.8, which everything is then multiplied by. So it has the form of an annual adjustment, but it is in fact, again, a fixed fraction. And you note that the number 1.6 rather than 1.8 is very different. And it reflects, again, the arbitrariness of this fixed fraction. So what that means, as Dr. Boiter explains, is that it has all the downsides of the Republic's primary case, but in fact, with respect, is even worse. And I'm going to just quickly take you to Dr. Boiter's evidence. It's in the core supplementary bundle. It's in tab 7. It's at page 161. And if your lordships will look at paragraph 57. Paragraph 57 explains the basic points with which Dr. Borenstein agreed, and I've just elaborated on. 60.1 over the page explains what the fixed fraction is. And it's an odd fixed fraction because it's not a comparison between constant 2004 prices and constant 1993 prices. It's instead between constant 2004 prices and a measure which is half 1993 prices and half 2004. It's a mishmash. And then at 61, Dr. Boyter goes on to explain that it has all the same drawbacks as the primary approach. And then at 62.1, he says, because it only adjusts for inflation, it makes it even less economic sense than the Republic's primary approach. And he's slightly or equally uncomplimentary when he goes to paragraph 62.2 and 62.3. He says, in short, it doesn't appear to be capable of producing a proper adjusted benchmark. And he says it's hard to understand why one would depart from the index figure. So if one steps back and asks, is this Hubbard deflator construction really what the parties intended? With respect, the answer is an emphatic no. It's not consistent with the meaning of the words. It doesn't use constant 1993 prices. It uses an odd hybrid. It requires rewriting the clause in the way that you've seen in the pleading. It requires assuming concepts such as the IPD, which are not referred to in the securities. It has no economic advantage over the existing rival constructions. And it is, with respect, just an attempt by the Republic to achieve the same result by a completely artificial means. And that, with respect, doesn't work. And that, with respect, is the end of my submission.
Thank you. Mr. Railton, do you and your team wish to reply?
My Lord, we do. And my Lord, hopefully not for too long, but there are a few points, I think, which it is appropriate just to cover. And I wasn't planning on saying anything about the law, on the basis that a couple of references that had come yesterday from Ms. Provisa I assumed were mistakes when referring to the need for us to establish irrationality. Now we accept that's the position in respect of Chartbrook, and we thought that she might only be referring to it in respect of Chartbrook, but she repeated it again this morning. So I think just to make sure we are all on the same page, as I am sure we are, irrationality is a Chartbrook standard. It is not the standard in relation to the normal construction process. Of course, if, for the purposes of the construction process, we can show irrationality, all good and well. But on the
Lord Hoffman said it's all part of the same process.
well, it's a process whereby you look at the different commercial consequences and you put them in the mix with the wording and all the other relevant circumstances, and then you excuse me, then you work out what the right construction of the particular words are. We do not have to show irrationality for that, and that's just an important and I hope common ground starting point, despite the occasional lapses of irrationality language earlier. Now, in doing that, in evaluating the rival constructions, it is at this stage, after the various submissions you've heard and the references to the evidence, it is actually necessary in our submission just to stand back for a moment and identify or attempt to identify what objective justification the respondents have for their suggested construction. And it has been put in a number of different ways by Ms. Provisa. But in essence, the only such justification that the respondents have put forward is that investors would want to tie the securities to the 1993 base measure and would want to do so because that was at the time the securities were issued, the measure being used by the Republic It had been in place, as you've seen, since 1999, and was, they say, a known quantity, the devil they knew, although it's not said what in particular, if indeed anything, was known about it, other than the fact that it was being published. And relatedly, it said, there was uncertainty and possibly moral hazard concerns as to what might happen on a future rebasing, which it would seem, those moral hazard issues, it would seem would be more troubling, I think it is suggested, for investors than the moral hazard involved in the Republic maintaining an obsolete series until 2034. So as we understand it, that's what's said to be, in the round, the objective reason for investors wanting to tie the securities to the 1993 base. And there is, of course, no evidence, and there doesn't need to be, I'm not suggesting there needs to be, there's no evidence that anyone actually thought that at the time, but it's clear from Ms. Previsa's submissions that this is the kernel of the objective commercial justification being put forward. Now, there are, at least in our submission, pulling matters together, 4 fundamental flaws with this that Ms. Previsa in our submission has not addressed or not adequately addressed. The first is that this is contrary to the judge's unchallenged findings as to the purpose and intention behind the securities. I know these are very familiar territory now, but I would remind you of them once again. They start in paragraph 154 of the judgment, on page 129 internally of Core 1, where the judge says, at the end of that paragraph, that he accepts that the fundamental purpose of the securities was to ensure the sustainability of payments for the Republic, to stabilise its financial position and prevent another default. And payments are only sustainable and affordable if any economic performance triggers are measured against the best measure of the real economy. And you'll remember the judge effectively accepted that in paragraphs 76 to 78 when he was referring about the purpose of the rebasing, where he refers to the true, the real, or the actual economy. And I'll be showing you that he accepted it also so later. Now, of course, I accept that Dr. Borenstein accepted that hypothetically a hash could be made of any rebasing, which would, I think, include the possibility of a hash being made of the 1993 rebasing. But the judge's findings were clear and unchallenged, and this is paragraph 78 of the judgment, that a rebased measure is likely to be a closer estimate of GDP than the old measure. Now, the reason why the rebased measure informs sustainability and affordability is the exact reason that the respondents rely on for different purposes, and that is the non-linear relationship so heavily relied upon by them. In other words, the point that my lords and my lady are very well familiar with now, that the 1993 measure could be showing a 5% growth for a particular reference year, but the 2004 measure could be showing a recession. And indeed, Ms. Previsa showed you yesterday the chart going back to the 50s and 60s. And I think it was 1956 that showed decent growth in one measure and a recession in another. But the up-to-date measure will necessarily be the best measure of what the economy is doing. And hence, importantly, the Republic's tax revenue and the Republic's ability to afford payments. Tax, as my lords and my lady will know, is the Republic's source of income. And that is driven by the real economy, not by a 1993 measure of it. So that's paragraph 154. Just to remind you again of paragraph 155, the judge then makes a further finding that is clear, thirdly, that the intention behind the securities was that payments would only be made when the Argentine economy was growing at a sufficiently healthy rate, and that they would not be made if the Republic's economy was not growing. And that, again, is, and indeed must be, a reference to the real, true, or actual economy alluded to by the judge in paragraph 76 to 78, and the best measure of it, not the 1993 economy. He never says that in any of these findings. And if the economy is not growing healthily in its best current measure, it is not growing healthily. And the fact that it may be growing in some outdated measure just does not meet this underlying intention. And finally, in paragraph 209 in this sequence, a passage that I showed you yesterday, beginning in the third line, when he's referring to some of Mr. Valentin's submissions, he refers to Mr. Valentin observing that the particular matter referred to relating to the real world economy is consistent with Dr. Boyter having agreed, in line with what I have myself already agreed, which is a reference back to the paragraphs I've shown you, that the purpose of the securities was to pay out when the real economy is growing at a healthy rate. And so with the need to adjust base case GDP in a way that makes it comparable to the best measure of the real economy. And again, note, not the 1993 measure of the economy. There is, I would repeat, no challenge to any of these findings. And the short point...
I'm not sure that's right. We go back to 155. I understand that there is a challenge to the first sentence of that. It means what you say the judge meant. It was not challenged if it meant economy growing or not growing by reference to the particular measurement, system of measurement that the instrument required, which on their case is 1993. No issue on that basis, but there is an issue if he meant what you say he meant.
Well, it's been quite clear from 76 to 78 and 209 what the judge meant, that he is referring to the real economy. It was only, I think, this morning when Mr. Barden, to some extent encouraged by my lord, did, I think, identify for the first time that there may be a question mark about acceptance of these findings that have been made. One doesn't see it, unless I've missed it, in the skeleton. Of course, there's no cross notice. And in relation to that, our starting point is, and it's an important starting point, I was making these submissions at the start of this very appeal. The findings that he has made, the unchallenged, we say, findings that he's made on purpose and intent, are actually critical. He had a lot of evidence before him in what was a comparatively long first instance trial, and he has made these findings. If there's to be a challenge to them, it needs to be properly set out and articulated. And this is just the first point in a sequence of 4 flaws, that if you're standing back and trying to just assess objectively the rival constructions, the first one is that the respondent simply doesn't meet these findings of the judge. Now that was the first point. The second point is that Ms. Provisa had in our submission no answer to the question as to why would an investor want to invest in an economy which, as Dr. Borenstein said, was not there. And that was illustrated by my Lord Lewison's, Lord Justice Lewison's example yesterday of electric vehicles, and indeed by my earlier examples of smartphones, computers, lithium and shale. On the respondent's construction, the investor is deprived of any share of economic innovation for the next 30 years. As Mr. Williamson questioned in his book, why would anyone want to do that? Now, thirdly, if what the respondents now suggest is correct, and there really was an intention underlying these securities, that the parties wanted to tie them for all times to the 1993 measure of GDP, one really has to ask the question, well, why didn't they say so in terms? And this isn't just a, well, they could have used clearer language point. It's a more fundamental point going to the nature of the securities. And if I could ask you, please, to pick up again the terms at page 30 of Core Bundle 1. And just to remind you that they are described just opposite the second hole punch as a GDP-linked security. They are expressed at the top in the large print opposite the sidebar as paying out on the basis of the performance of the gross domestic product of the Republic. But that is not what the respondents say these securities do. They say they are linked to the 1993 measure and not to GDP. In other words, what they say is equivalent to linking the securities to a fixed index and not to the Republic's GDP from time to time. And on their approach, not only are the securities inaccurately labelled, but there is, on a fair and objective reading, nothing in them anywhere that tells a reader in terms that this is a 1993 instrument. On the contrary, the reader is told, if one goes through this, that, for example, if you pick up on page 35, the definition in respect of actual real GDP, or more importantly, actual real GDP growth, what the reader is told is that actual real GDP, in that sense, in the growth definition, will move from 1993 on a rebasing to the new measure. You're told that, first of all, that happens in the definition of actual real GDP because it's tied to the year of base prices. And you remember the year of base prices definition
Yes.
is 1993 until it changes. And then growth is envisaging that you're looking at it in the 2004 basis. And it is, we would suggest, at the least a reasonable expectation from the text that base case GDP and growth, and therefore the operation of the payment conditions, will work in the same way and will appropriately reflect, as the adjustment provision requires the adjustment to do, the rebasing. And indeed, as my lords and my lady will have in mind, the conscientious reader will be aware from the warning in the supplemental prospectus that I showed you yesterday, that, as it says, any alteration in the calculation or composition of GDP by index may result in a decrease in value of or return on the GDP-linked securities. That's Supplemental Bundle 2, tab 25, page 59. In other words, the reader would be alive to the point that a change in base year might have some substantive economic effect on the payment triggers, which of course on the respondent's case, it does not. Then what the reader sees in terms when going through the rest of the security and comes to the base case definition, the reader sees a 7-line proviso, which turns out, the respondents say, to sideline any adjustment to base case and to tie the securities not to GDP, but to the then obsolete 1993 measure. And it is not just the redundancy or the why bother point in relation to the wording of the adjustment provision, although that's part of it. I've made my submissions in respect of that. It is the bigger point of why, just standing back, if the parties genuinely wanted the securities to be indexed to the 1993 measure, why didn't they say so? If the respondents are right, it is an extraordinary omission. That was the third point in the sequence of four. The fourth point is that the exercise of looking at commercial purpose and consequences is, of course, not limited to the interests of investors. And significantly, Ms. Provisa has put forward no freestanding objective commercial reason as to why the Republic would want in any circumstances to tie itself for the life of the securities to 1993 base. And as far as we can discern, only two factors have been put forward as to why the Republic might agree to it. The first is the point that Ms. Provisa mentioned yesterday, and that's that the Republic, it said, was up against the wall and investors had the whip hand in negotiations. But if that is an explanation for this, and the Republic gave in to dominant investor pressure, it is frankly inconceivable that the respondent's position wouldn't have been clearly set out in the documents. And indeed, Mr. Barden showed you this morning literature going beyond the 2004 literature that I showed you that contemplated the possibility of tying an issuer to an old measure. But what that literature, both in 2004 and subsequently, says is if it's to be done, it needs to be done clearly, ex ante. And if that is the approach that it is hypothetically being suggested was being adopted by the drafters and the parties in relation to this, why wasn't it done clearly? And it simply wasn't. So that was the first suggestion as to where the Republic's interests may be. The second was that it seemed to be suggested that the amounts involved weren't in the scheme of things very large. Not quite sure where this goes, but we understood, or at least I understood, that what the point seemed to be suggesting was that because the amounts in the scheme of things weren't very large, the Republic might not have been particularly concerned about it. But that is patently wrong. I mean, first, the nominal amount of the securities depended on how many of the 92 US dollar billion creditors accepted the restructuring offer. But those who did received a security in the nominal amount equal to the principal amount of the bonds that they were tendering for exchange. You may remember we saw that yesterday from the SEC Form 18KA at Supplemental Bundle 1, tab 13, page 244. Now that's important. The bonds, these securities are not being issued in respect of the haircut amount, they're being issued in respect of the principal amount. But secondly, in relation to this, even with a 48% payment cap, that is a huge amount of money. And I understand that across all GDP securities, the payment cap would amount to approximately 35 billion US dollars, of which about 1/3 has already been paid now. And in relation to 2012, which was the last year of payment before the reference year, the subject of these proceedings, payments, I understand, totaled 3.5 billion US dollars, representing then about 0.6% of Argentina's GDP for that year. And that is, with the greatest of respect to the respondents, an enormous sum in terms of a nation. 0.6% translating through other government functions, services, and the like is enormous. And indeed, even the normal discussions that we have here as to what percentage of GDP should be paid on defence or on the health service or on other matters like that, 0.6 is not a figure that can, if this indeed is what the respondents were doing, can be brushed aside as saying, well, it wouldn't matter, it wouldn't be worthy of detailed attention by the Republic.
It would mean that even on that year, growth of only 0.6% would meet a sustainability criteria. Way short of the 3% or whatever.
Well, what you're assuming there is that every item of growth in the economy goes towards this. But that's not how economies work. There are ongoing obligations, which is why states, countries pay certain things that you can reference by reference to the total amount of GDP on certain points. You can't say, well, if the economy grows by 0.6%, that means this is covered. I mean, you may be right in terms, but that is saying 100% of economic progress that has been made in that year, or 2 years, or whatever the period is, goes towards this.
Well, none of these things are exact, but I think the point that's put against you generally is it's no good looking at sustainability as if you could only afford to pay if you reached the 3.22% or 3%.
But the important point is, though, that when the parties were putting this together, in line with what the judge found to be the fundamental purpose and intention, they were baking in the payment conditions, whereby the economy had to be at a certain level and it had to grow at a certain rate. Those triggered it, and that was the underlying purpose. And it is no good saying, well, in fact, you could have scraped by if you might have been able to get more debt and to increase your level of debt and therefore paid. It's no good saying you could scrape by on something less. The whole idea is to devise something that first solves the problem that the Republic was then in, but secondly, solves it going forward. And that was the purpose. But that was the fourth point that the respondents were relying upon. And we suggest, just simply doesn't meet the bigger questions. In relation to a related but slightly different point, it was suggested by Ms. Provisa that Dr. Boyter's evidence supported the respondent's construction and therefore provided some stand-back rational support for the judge's findings. Now, you were shown the references in relation to that, and I won't go there again. But we should point out that what Dr. Boyter accepted was that the opinions that he was putting forward were proceeding, indeed in a sense as you would expect, on the basis that the bargain was 1993 year of base prices. And if I could just give you some references for this, but not at the moment invite you to turn it up. It's supplemental bundle 4, tab 63, first page 111, and then pages 112 to 113. He was proceeding on the basis that it was the 1993 bargain, and he was never able to explain independently why investors would want to be tied to the 1993 year of base prices.
What page are we looking at?
Well, I wasn't actually, I was simply giving you the references in view of time and that this is a reply. But if my lord will find it useful to go to them, I'm very happy to. If I could move on to a different point, that relating to growth rates. Because the respondent's case, as Ms. Provisa has made clear, also requires that the growth rates inherent in the base case table are 1993 growth rates only. And that's critical to what they say their case is on the bargain, and indeed their goalposts or score sheet arguments. And those arguments simply don't work if, in fact, the growth rates represent a medium or long-term view of the Argentine economy, in whatever measure it may be expressed in from time to time. Now, Ms. Provisa, as you've heard, relies on the column headings in the base case table on page 36, which tells us what the benchmark levels in 1993 base case are. In a sense, that's obvious. They're constant 1993 pesos. But that really, in our submission, takes matters no further, as the benchmark at that time could only be expressed in the then current measure of GDP. So one needs to look further to see what other admissible material there might be to establish the respondents' contention. And they had previously, doggedly, relied on a case that the growth rates were derived from the 1993 base case estimates. But that was untenable and rightly abandoned yesterday. And beyond that, there is the expert and factual evidence before the judge, and indeed the judge's findings. But the primary point on which the respondents have relied has, as we understand it, been abandoned. Now, as to the experts, it is important that you do keep in mind what you were showed yesterday in relation to the key agreed matters in the GDP Securities Expert Joint Statement. And I would ask you please to turn that up again at supplemental volume 3, tab 47, page 110. I think you've now been...
Are these in core supplemental?
I'm so sorry, I'm in the supplemental bundle.
Tab 5, core bundle, supplementary.
It is. So sorry, I haven't fully converted. Internal page 4. But it's paragraph 10. You've seen it a number of times, but it is critical. The experts are agreeing that base case is based on estimates of 1, the long-run growth rate of potential output, the long-run trend, to the initial cyclical position of the economy, the initial condition. Base case GDP was denominated in 1993 pesos because actual world GDP was estimated using the 1993 GDP year of base prices at the time that the security was issued. Now, it's important that, or in fact, perhaps I should show you, because I'm conscious that I may not have done and just simply given you the references to it earlier. But if I could ask you to go back in supplemental bundle 3, Dr. Boiter's first report, just to show you that the experts agree on what potential GDP is. You've seen it in the judgment. The judge did it by reference to Mr. Katz's witness statement, which explained potential GDP and potential output. I was discouraged, I think, on Tuesday from going to Mr. Katz's witness statement, but it may be as well to show it by Dr. Boiter's. And if you can go in tab 46 to page 77.
Internal page?
Internal page 20. And just to, it's paragraph 79 and 82, where Dr. Boiter says the notion of base case GDP interpreted as fair 30-year forecast of real GDP at the time the securities were issued is shaped by 2 key economic concepts. The first is what is often called potential GDP. Second is cyclical deviation from potential GDP. Then he refers to a definition from Powell and others of potential GDP. And over the page in paragraph 82, as you will see, he states his belief correctly that he and Dr. Borenstein agree. And importantly, as you will see, that is not by reference to any particular base year. And it's reasonable to ask, why would it be if it's known that over the period of the estimate, the base year is likely to change on a number of occasions, and the economy will inevitably change shape. If you're trying to find a benchmark route going forward, why tie it to a stagnant 1993 economy and assume that that economy will be there until 2034, when in fact you know it won't be? And why not also look back at what the economy has done historically and form a fair view on the long-term growth in the RAD? That is the objective. That's what potential GDP targets. And we would say there's nothing, going back to the terms of the security, nothing in the expert evidence to suggest that a reasonable investor or a reasonable issuer would interpret the embedded growth rates as being 1993 specific. And there's equally, for what worth, nothing in the factual evidence which does that. On the contrary, the factual evidence from Mr. Katz, accepted by the judge, showed the opposite. Now, you may consider that that evidence and the consistent evidence as to what he and Dr. Nilsson shared with investors doesn't really take matters much further in the broad scheme of things. And I've addressed that separately and will return very briefly to it later. But even if that is so, what you cannot do in our submission is to make any assumption that any reasonable investor was proceeding on the basis that the growth rates underlying the securities were 1993 specific. There is no material that supports that. Now, just moving on, if I can, from that point, and pick up on 2 points as to the wording of the adjustment provision that were addressed by Ms. Provisa, or not addressed. The first goes back to the at any time point. And Ms. Provisa suggested that the at any time being referred to in the second line of the condition element of the proviso was the time when a calculation was being made in respect of a particular reference year. And we say that that is, with the greatest of respect, simply not possible on this wording, as it's not qualified in that way, or indeed any other way. And while we would accept, as I hope I did earlier, in answer to my Lord Justice Popplewell's questions, that at any time can mean a continuing state of affairs, as in no parking at any time or something of that sort. The period covered by it begins in the context of a conditional contractual clause when the event, the subject of the condition, occurs. And just as a matter of language, the any time is engaged on and after the rebasing. And you can test it in this way. If in 2014, immediately after the rebasing, you wanted to know if base case GDP for 2016 had been adjusted, you would go to this provision and the answer would be yes, of course it has. The adjustment proviso has been engaged because at any time, that time has been arrived at.
You said on and after the rebasing, but I think you mean on, don't you?
It's triggered, yes, on the rebasing. I'm so sorry if I said
that. Which is the case against you.
I'm grateful for my Lord picking that up, but I hope, despite despite any linguistic infelicities, I hope the meaning of what I'm saying is clear.
Yes.
The second point, just to touch on briefly, is that Ms. Provisa, possibly deliberately, but she has not separately engaged with the mandatory obligation in the event part of the adjustment proviso. But that mandatory obligation, which I went through on Tuesday, is critical. The clause requires you to adjust each reference year then. And the reason that that is not done on the respondent's construction is because it can't be done, as the information isn't available then. And that's whether or not an implied term is crafted to make it available later. It simply isn't available. The figures necessary cannot enable an adjustment to be made for all years then. And this points, we would suggest strongly, to their construction being wrong. An obligation to adjust to reflect the change at a particular time should be capable of performance at that time. On our construction it is, on the respondent's construction it isn't.
What exact moment of time do you say it is when the trigger occurs? If, in this case, at the beginning of 2013, it had been announced that for 2013 a new 2004 year basis price would be used. Is that the moment at which the trigger occurs?
I'm afraid at the moment familiar enough with the evidence to know whether there is actually a simple answer to that, in the sense as to whether rebasing is announced in advance of figures being released or whether they're released at the same time. But it's when the moment of rebasing happens, which is when the year of base prices changes, when it becomes a calendar year other than 1993, that is the moment of trigger.
So it's when the new the GDP is published in the new year of basis figures. Is that what you say is the moment of trigger?
If that is the moment when the year of base prices changes, which I understand it to be, but I will be corrected by others around me if my lord is targeting whether there could be a slight difference, whether a scintilla or something greater, between an announcement of a change in year of base prices and then actually publication of data. I don't believe there is. I think, as Ms. Provisa said, then one can understand that there is a process of rebasing going on. But the change, the formal change in year of base prices happens when the reference year figures are actually identified.
Even if the quarterly figures are published during the course of the year in the new basis?
Oh, no, sorry. Well, then that will be wrong for me to say reference year. I mean, when GDP figures in the new base are published, whether they're published quarterly or annually.
Well, if that's right, then and you've got the same problem on your construction of not being able to do the calculation at the moment the trigger occurs. Because if you get in June 2013, it having been announced at the beginning of the year that the 2013 figures are going to be in 2004 basis figures, and in June 2013 you get the March first quarter figures in 2004 basis. If that's the trigger, you haven't got your annual GDP in the new basis, have you? So on your case you can't do the exercise. That's why I was exploring the question.
I'm very grateful to my lord for that point, because that is a further reason why it must be the prior year of 2012. Because one can see you need to do adjustment. The first year to which it's going to be relevant is 2013. 2012, we say, is the year in respect of which you're, because of all the factors I've been through before, the immediately preceding year, which clearly has got to be adjusted. It's the year, the only year, in respect of which, in the normal course, you're going to get the 1993 measure being published. And so it's a question in respect of the positions of 2012. It's not a problem for our construction that the change may be either significantly, momentarily, or in some other different period of time between the announcement of the change and the completion of a reference year, of a full calendar year. It simply doesn't matter.
Would you accept that we have to interpret this adjustment provision as a whole?
Absolutely.
And would you accept that looking at what you've called the condition, the event and the method, the way in which each of those components is expressed may shed light on what the other components mean?
My lord, of course.
Because at the moment, I think you seem to me to be dividing up this provision into almost watertight compartments.
My lord, for the purpose of analysis, yes, I am doing that because I do think it is important to go through them one by one to see what they mean. Because if you're then standing back and you're trying to sort of raise above some of the detail to say what actually did the parties mean by this, as well as all the overall factors that we've been talking about, of course you have to look at it in the round and with the other provisions. That's absolutely right. But when you do have the dominant clauses of the condition and the event, you cannot stand back and say, well, it must be that something else must have been intended, because the language there is driving the main point. Now, there are a few other miscellaneous points that I can address, but I hope very briefly. First, if I could invite you to pick up our skeleton argument and go to the annex to it. As this has been criticised by the Miss Provisor. And one of the main criticisms was said that it removed the year of base price definition and then tweaked the actual real GDP definition to tie it to 1993 prices. Now, yes, that is what is done. It could equally easily been done in a different way to exactly the same effect. The annex could just as easily have left actual real GDP unchanged, but then, and reinstated year of base prices, but deleting the proviso. Those are changes of exactly the same effect. The criticism is not one of substance, simply one of form, and it's not even a fair criticism. And one of the reasons why it's not a fair criticism is the substantive question is, well, the substantive point. It wasn't suggested, as you will have seen by Ms. Provisor, that the annex is inaccurate. It is not suggested that it doesn't accurately reflect the consequences of the respondent's construction. On the respondent's case, the adjustment provision has no effect. It's not just neutralized, it is obliterated. And that is important.
I think one of the points that's put against you, and I think this applies equally to your revision you've just suggested, is that it would lead to a definition of actual real GDP, which is not what anybody would call real GDP, which would be a very odd starting point.
Well, my lord, is meant to be, on the respondent's case, in a world, a parallel and unreal world, we'd suggest, but in a world where this is a security that is linked for all time to 1993 GDP. And that is the point. We would gratefully agree that no one in their right minds would be thinking that actual real GDP for all time is going to be the 1993 measure. But that is the respondent's case. And this is really at the core.
Would that produce the same actual nominal GDP for payment purposes?
But that's a different point. That's rebasing. That's got nothing to do with year of base prices.
No, but if you did this,
Yes.
that would affect the payment amount, wouldn't it?
Yeah, not at all. And the reason why it doesn't And I'm sorry if I went through this too quickly before, but you'll remember that the payment amount, and in particular excess GDP, what you're looking at on the respondent's case is, assume you've got through the payment conditions, the level and the performance condition. What you're looking at when it comes to the payment amount is the extent by which actual nominal GDP exceeds the nominal base case GDP. So what you're looking at is how essentially actual GDP has exceeded base case, which is on the respondent's measure, 1993 base case, and then you're converting it by the GDP deflator into nominal figures. So the outperformance is measured by 1993, the nominal amount, and just to remind you, in the GDP deflator, the nominal amount is effectively defined by being the gross domestic product of Argentina.
The GDP deflator essentially takes out actual real GDP from the equation and turns it into one.
Well, yes, indeed. But we've fully accepted, and I may come back to this separately in a moment, we fully accept that the rebasing is relevant. The rebasing is relevant because nominal GDP or current prices GDP continues to be published on the current base. And that's a current figure. But that is a result of the rebasing. It's got nothing to do with the adjustment provision, adjusting base case.
No, sorry, I'm not on whether it has anything to do with the adjustment provision. I'm on whether it has anything to do with the definition of actual real GDP, which is, in your reworking, is changed. And I was just trying to work out whether that has any effect on the on the payment amount. And I was forgetting, I think, that although the payment amount is expressed by a formula that uses actual real GDP to meet the nominal amount, that is actually taken out from the top and bottom of the equation by the GDP deflator.
And it's what's referred to as the numerator of the GDP deflator, my lord is quite right, that is really the current price point. So that was the annex. Could I turn briefly now to the Hubbard deflator? And some criticisms have been made by Ms. Provisa as to how this particular argument has arisen. And you've seen that it came through Professor Hubbard, came comparatively late. But our submission is, well, however it arises, this is a matter of construction. And if in fact it's the correct construction, then it should be adopted. And one needs, of course, to look at all the factors. As with any other construction issue, one needs to look at that in the round. Now, my lord, dealing first with my Lord Justice Popplewell's question of yesterday as to what the link actually is that enables you to identify the deflator. It is, going back to supplemental volume 3, tab 52. This is Professor Hubbard's report. And at page 266, this is a paragraph 115 of the report, and it's step 2, small b, 4 lines from the bottom.
I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry.
I'm trying to use the core supplemental. Is this bit in the core supplemental?
I'm a. Lord, I'm told page 243 of the core supplement.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Lord, I do apologise for the different references. And picking up on that first line of step 2, employee index GDP deflator from 1993 to 2004. And it's footnote 171 that I think my lord was asking about. We have clicked on the relevant link, and we do have, or we have attempted to produce a printout from it, if it would help my lord in seeing where the fraction comes from. If I could ask that to be handed up. Do we have copies? This is Spanish. We put it on A3 because as the way of things, it comes out quite small, but it still does come out quite small. But the relevant part to look at is if you look in the top at 1993 under the period heading, and in the first column, total supply, you will see GDP at market prices at 100. And then if you go down to 2004 and go across to the same entry, you'll see it at 160.4. And this is a table, and that shows where the 160 or the 1.6 comes from. But this is a table that is effectively using 1993 prices and showing the extent to which they have inflated or deflated, depending which way you're looking at it, across different periods. And it's as simple as that.
But across the whole economy, rather than tailored to any particular basket that is used for any year of basis series.
I'm so sorry, my lord, I missed a...
But across the whole economy as a whole, rather than tailored to any basket or weighting that is used for any year of basis series producing the GDP.
Well, my lord, I think this relates to base year 1993, as one sees in very small print, just above the total supply line at the top. So you are looking at base year 1993.
I think that's confirmed in the paragraph on what you took us to.
Great.
Alongside
So what this is intending to do, it's looking at the economy in 1993. It is calibrating that at 100 for 1993, then measuring the comparative prices going forward.
Yes, but using, if you like, the basket from 1993.
Yes, that's right. Absolutely. It's in that sense, it's a like for like comparison. Now, the linguistic issue, which gives rise to this argument, of course, is the one at the end of the base case proviso. And this is the problem, with a problem on the respondent's case in respect of this, that the denominator uses the defined term of actual real GDP. And this really is important to keep in mind, because the respondents approach that on the basis of ignoring the definition. And the definition, as from the moment of change, which, again, by definition, will be the relevant one if you're in the territory of the adjustment proviso. The definition requires actual real GDP to be measured in constant prices for the year of base prices. In other words, 2004. So the construction challenge is, well, your denominator is actual real GDP in 2004 base, and otherwise it would be actual real GDP in 2004 base and prices. But you are being told that it's measured in constant 1993 prices. Now, the word constant just gets you back to the 1993 prices. It's a contrast to current. So you're looking at the 1993 prices, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to work out how you should deal with the 2004 base applying 1993 prices. And you have, as I know my lords and my lady have seen, you've got both the numerator and the denominator using the same point of embarkation, actual real GDP in 2004 year of base prices. So you're starting off that they are doing a like for like. They're both in 2004 base. And the key contrast is between the prices applicable. And Professor Hubbard's short point is that it must be an adjustment for inflation based on the 1993 to 2004 ratio.
If there comes to be a rebasing in 2030, then the two steps will not be comparing like for like, because the basket will have changed in 2030.
Well, my lord, as Professor Hubbard explains, that's because you then put in an additional step. And I think that the judge referred to a step being taken, say, another rebasing in 2017. So what you would do, you would be deflating from 2017 to 2004. You would then deflate from 2004 to 1993.
But the 2004 basket would be different from the 1993 basket.
Well, the 2004 basket, yes, will always be different.
So
But what you would be, if you're looking at 2017, and you're running this through here, the numerator would be actual real GDP in 2017 year of base prices.
I understand that, but you were saying a minute or two ago that Professor Hubbard's formula compared like with like, but it only does that on the first rebasing. If you have a second rebasing, it doesn't do that.
Well, my lord, I'm not sure that's right, because the inflator or the deflator that he is taking will be looking at the actual real. I mean, he'll be looking at the same. He'll be looking at, instead of on the chart I've given you, the 1993 deflator, he'll be looking at the 2004.
Exactly.
So 2004 will begin again with 100, and it will give you a figure.
Yes, but the figures from 2030 on this hypothetical rebasing will take you back to 2004, no further, and then you start again at 100 and go back to 1993, but the first half of your calculation and the second half of your calculation are based on different baskets.
Well, yes, I accept that to some extent, but my lord is also envisaging that you are doing, if you like, one calculation at a particular time. What's actually happened, if the wording of the proviso is followed, at the moment of change to 2004, you have recalibrated all the base case entries. And so you now have a particular base case in 2004 terms, which are set out.
Okay,
You would then,
so you, just to be clear, you would accept that on this alternative construction, you could also produce a table of revised prices at 2000 on the first rebasing,
on the Hubbard deflator approach, yes, you could.
just as in your primary case.
Yes.
It would be a different table, but it's
It'd be a different table with a different figure.
but you can still produce the figures in advance.
Yes,
as it
indeed.
were.
How did you get to the the constant 1993 prices? That's what I haven't quite understood.
Well, by deflating down, but it's important to recognise here that if Professor Hubbard is right, that what you're looking at is an adjustment for inflation. So the adjustment has to be looking at the similar basket. So you're comparing like for like, effectively current to real in that sense. But there's no logical or other reason for not doing that differently, insofar as your indicator on the secondary basing is going to say, well, the way in which you can compare figures from 2017 to 2030 is by looking at the 2017 base, because that is giving you the best measure of the economy of 2017, and it's telling you how prices have moved in that period by reference to that.
Leave aside the secondary basing, I'm sorry if I'm being rather slow on this. What this deflator does, getting down to 160.4, is deflate the prices that are in the 1993 basket, because it's by reference to 1993 GDP.
Yes.
And it's the price inflation, it's deflating for the price inflation of the prices that are in the 1993 basket.
Absolutely.
And then what the Hubbard deflator does is apply that to what's in the 2004 basket. But this isn't a measure of what the prices have done between 1993 and 2004 in relation to what's in the 2004 basket, is it?
My lord, I think that's right, but what it is a measure of...
Isn't that the flaw in
No.
using it to take what you say is right as a matter of construction, actual real GDP, meaning 2004 basis, and then applying something which is not a measure of how prices have moved in relation to that basket, but a measure of how prices have moved in relation to a different basket?
Well, the purpose of it is to try to identify inflation between 1993 and 2004. Because 2004 doesn't go back to 1993, you cannot use the 2004 measure. But what you can use is 1993. And indeed, you're being asked to use...
Sorry to interrupt you. Inflation in what? Inflation will run at different rates in relation to all sorts of different products. And what you're trying to do is deflate the 2004 methodological basket, which logically one can only do if you're stripping out the effect of inflation in relation to those prices that are in that basket. So if you use a deflator that's referable to the prices of the particular parts of that basket.
But one's also got to be guided by the language of the denominator in respect of this, because you are being told to use 2004 base. That's actual real GDP. And you are being told to measure it in 1993 prices. Now, the challenge that Professor Hubbard had, well, how do you do that? If that is actually inflation, as he says, well, it's what it must be if you're true to these definitions. And 1993 is telling you that what the measure you should be looking at is inflation in 1993. And there's no other, and so it's got to be between 1993 and 2004. Otherwise, how would you convert it?
Yeah, but at the start of 415, the expert says the best deflator to use. One of the points being made against you is if you do take this inflation approach, there's more than one way of doing it.
I'm sure, and I think that both Professor Hubbard and other experts have said, well, yes, there are different inflation indexes, but what you've got to do as part of the construction exercise, you're faced with actual real GDP in 2004. You're faced with the obligation to get that into 1993 prices, and it's a question really of the mechanics. And the reasonable and the best one that has been put forward by Professor Hubbard is this: published one. And it's a construction exercise. I mean, if someone were to come up, which they haven't, and saying, well, actually what this must mean, the better and preferable construction of this would be X, then there would be, in a sense, a choice between it. But the construction that we're putting forward, based on what Professor Hubbard says, is actually the only one that's been positively advanced by anyone. Of course, you could say, well, there are 100 different ways and each is equally as good as each other. But that's not this position. If you're trying to work out what the clause is actually doing, the language isn't perfect in respect of it, but the language isn't perfect in many respects, in a number of aspects of these securities. But if you're trying to work that out, Professor Hubbard's solution, we say, is a viable and good one. And I think there are only two other points in relation to this raised by Ms. Pavisa that I should address. First, it was suggested that this was somehow an overwriting for 2012 using 2004 base and converting it to 1993 prices. That's simply wrong. This is a different exercise. Of course, in 2012, you have had actual real GDP produced in 1993 base year. Of course you have. But when you're getting to do this exercise, you have got also 2012 actual real GDP in 2004 year of base prices. It's the first year of the backcasting. And this is not overwriting. This is just saying there is a different measure. It's again the same overlap point that not only we rely on, but also the respondents rely on. While in relation to deflators, it is probably just worth mentioning that the movement that the respondents need to make in respect of deflators, and here the difficulty posed to them by actual real GDP being defined in 2004, is a problem that the respondents have also in relation to the payment amount and the way they go about calculating that. And you remember that the payment amount as defined, or it's through the GDP deflator, I should say, asks for the denominator to be actual real GDP for such reference year. But just reminding you of it, Dr. Boyter's approach in relation to this in supplemental bundle 3, tab 46, page 100.
Is this his report?
It is his report.
So it'll be in the core supplementary.
Lord, I'm so sorry.
Core?
It's internal page 43.
This is Appendix 3.
Appendix
Yes,
3A.
yes, indeed.
Yeah? Appendix 3.
And it's the point that just to remind you, equation 1.23 is where you have Dr. Boyter applying the respondent's approach. And what they do, it's a point I made shortly before, but it warrants, I think, in light of the discussion about the Hubbard deflator, just going back to it. You see in equation 1.23 that he is taking EN 2013, which is excess GDP in the new year of base prices for 2013. And that equals, and then it's that first equation is his deflator. And that's actual nominal in the new GDP measure, which is absolutely right. We agree with that. That's the GDP deflator headline numerator. but it's over QO 2013. And again, if you have a finger in internal page 37, you will see that that is actual real GDP in 2013 at the old base year prices. And so what he is doing is he's applying that as the deflator, which is how you, on the respondents case, bridge the gap between having outperformance dealt with in 1993 year of base prices and the nominal or the payment amount, which needs to be translated into nominal figures. And the point of just reminding you about this here is that, as with that last line or last two lines of the adjustment proviso, what the respondents do on their approach is, in our submission, slightly play fast and loose with the definitions. Actual real GDP means what it says within the definitions when it suits them. When it doesn't suit them, they're very happy to apply the old year of base prices as a measure of actual real GDP, when that is not how it is defined within the securities. There are, I think, only 2 or 3 more points that I need to address, and I will do them as briefly as I can. The first goes back to the overlap year point, which I hope I can take briefly, as you may think I've already over-addressed it, but it's been suggested, as we understand it, that it's effectively an invention by us for the purposes of our submissions. But there are, if that is the suggestion, there are 2 elements here. The first is, as I've already submitted to you, the concept of an overlap year, which is clear from the formula itself. If Professor Hubbard is wrong in relation to the construction of the denominator on the base case GDP adjustment provision, the concept is there in any event because you have to have those figures in 1993 and 2004 for the year. The difference between us is we say that's 1 year, they say it's 22 years. And of course, it's apparent from the base case growth definition. So the subject to Professor Hubbard, the concept is not in doubt. Now, as to the choice of overlap year, I mean, framed as the word choice is itself slightly loaded in its suggesting that it's free to the Republic to choose which it is. We don't say that so. We say that what actually happens is that it can be determined with some confidence from the context of the clause what the overlap year is. And as we know, it can't be 2013, as the information isn't available in respect of that year in the ordinary course for it. We know that no year before 2012 needs to be adjusted. So there's no reason to go to one of those. And 2012 is the last year for which the information will, in the ordinary course, be available. And that year, as the most recent, is going to be the best reflection in our submission of where the 2 different measures are at the time of change. And it's a matter that my Lord Justice Lewison has raised, I think, more than once. And so it's right that I just give you the reference to Dr. Borenstein's report at paragraph 22.1, which is in the core supplemental bundle, tab 5, page 116. And you may want to turn it up now. And it really starts about halfway down on internal page 14, where Dr. Borenson said this approach has intuitive appeal. If I could perhaps invite you to read that. And it is in our respectful submission just wrong to say that GDP in, say, the year 2004 would be better. That, of course, was when the new base year incepted, if you like. But its application then is to the year 2004, some 8 years earlier. And the economy has moved since then. And the clause we would suggest is targeting a comparison of the different measures, not then, but at the time of the change of year of base prices. If I could move on briefly to the question of matrix. First of all, the literature that was referred to. There's one item of literature before that you were shown before the securities were issued, and elements of literature that you were shown to, or the rest of it, after the securities were issued. The literature, I mean, insofar as it's been relied on for factual matrix, that after the securities are issued is not factual matrix.
I don't think it is being relied on for that purpose, and it couldn't be. I think
Yes.
the main thrust of what Mr. Barden was using it for was to say that the implied term suggested by the respondents is not a crackpot idea.
But, well, I follow that to a degree, in the sense that what you have is literature that says that if you want to do it in this way, you need to, in advance, set out clearly.
And you've said it's not; they haven't done it clearly. I've got that point.
Yes,
But,
it doesn't.
But the experts, I think, were saying, well, no country in the world has ever done this. Therefore, it's a crazy idea. And I think the literature was designed to show, well, it's not that crazy because a lot of people recommend it.
Yes, but recommended that the idea of implying something that has never been done, and the basis for the implication is that you should be specifying particularly what is required to be done, is slender. But if that's the extent to which it's been relied on, in the sense, and it's not been relied on more for factual matrix, then fine. But I would suggest that even in relation to implied term, if you're suggesting as to what business efficacy at that time would be understood to be, then it may be more relevant to be looking at literature in place there. The second point I think I can take very briefly is that Mr. Barden, I think, as I understood him this morning, was now suggesting that certain matters that the judge referred to as being factual matrix weren't in fact factual matrix. You will not see that in the respondent's skeleton argument. Paragraph 58 and 68 in particular, and the paragraphs in between, do not make that point. There is no challenge to the judge's findings, and it is simply not open to them now in this way to seek to challenge that. But I'm not intending at this stage, by way of reply, to go through any of that material. You've had my submissions in relation to it. As to the proportional link.
Sorry, but just before you leave that topic, the tweets and statement that Dr. Nelson made in 2014, which were to the effect that the, as confirmed in cross-examination, calculation is to be interpreted, it produces a figure in accordance with what the respondents say is the right construction in this case. Now that's not factual matrix because it wasn't for the contract, but I think that's relied on for similar reasons that my lord expressed in relation to the idea of keeping figures, that it rather gives the lie to the suggestion that it would be irrational for anyone to think that the economic and commercial consequences could possibly support the construction for which the respondents contend.
Well, my
Can you
lord,
say anything about that?
I see that, and certainly from a point of view of standing back objectively, and you will have seen probably from other pre-reading, although not documents we've either of us have specifically taken you to, that there were in 2014 in the analyst world two views on what the correct construction was. I think the view deemed the mainstream view was our view, but there was another view that was floating about in 2014. None of this relevant to the matrix. But one also has just got to ask, though, and keep in mind that when you're looking at 2014, nearly a decade after the securities have been issued, and in the real world, this is relevant to the entrepreneurial purchases in the secondary market of these particular bonds. And we all know, as common knowledge, that there is a market in which, quite fairly and properly, weaknesses in wordings of note issues are leveraged by those who have economic interests in doing so. Now, one's got to have a little element of care that arguments that are framed when there's intense focus on different issues at a later date, nearly 10 years after the securities are issued, actually represent what people were thinking at the particular time. Now, they may do, insofar as they have...
Well, that may be a fair point generally, but it doesn't apply to Dr. Nilsson, does it? He was at the Ministry of Economy at the time that these were designed, wasn't he?
Yes, and it's 10 years on, and he's no longer at the Ministry of Economy. But I make a point, and I equally take your point, my lord, that if you have sensible people making sensible arguments, whatever the motivation for them being made, they are sensible arguments. But you have to stand back, I think, and particularly take on board the factors that I've endeavoured to summarise for you earlier this afternoon, and actually form the view. And this isn't in the chart book context where I fully accept different points arise. This is in the context of looking at the consequences and trying to work out what the parties actually intended at the time.
Well, it applies to both, doesn't it?
Sorry.
It applies to both. It's looking at the commercial and economic consequences, both for the purposes of the iterative process, what one would describe as the normal construction process, and for the chart book point, where there's the higher threshold of nonsense or absurdity or irrationality.
Oh, indeed, my lord. The note that had distracted me momentarily while my lord was putting the point to me was to remind me that Dr. Nilsson was in opposition at the time of the tweets in Argentina. Now, on the proportional link, I hope I can take this briefly, but Ms. Provisa's submissions have, in our submission, confused again. It's based on paragraph 224 of the judgment. They've confused again the link between nominal GDP and the payment amount, which I sought to label earlier this week as the truism, which does apply before and after rebasing, and the link from the respondents' approach, which arises on rebasing only, which was the link I showed you in equation 1.25 of Dr. Boiter's calculations. We looked at 1.23 shortly before, but the easiest way for present purposes to show you this is to show you the cross-examination of Dr. Borenstein. which is in Supplemental Bundle 4, tab 64. At page 150, or beginning at page 151. And it's quite a long passage, but I would ask you to read it. It begins page 151, internal page 27, at line 22, when Mr. Barden, who's cross-examining, moves on to what he calls the third topic, which is the payment amount, not covered by Dr. Borenstein in his first report. And then picking it up in line 6 on page 28, let's see if we can agree, because I think there's some common ground. As I understood the cross-examination of Dr. Boyter yesterday, it seems to be agreed that prior to a rebasing, there's a proportional relationship between nominal GDP and the payment amount. Is that right? And Dr. Borenstein says, once again, the proportional relationship is between the ratio you mentioned measured in 1 year of base prices and that same ratio measured in a different year of base prices. But the proportional relationship between actual nominal and the payment amount, that exists, doesn't it? It is measured, that ratio, the payment amount and nominal GDP. 1 year of base prices is proportional to measuring in the old year of base prices. It doesn't mean it's the same proportion over time. Again, as I understand, it's common ground that on the claimant's interpretation, that proportional relationship remains post-basing, but on the public's interpretation, it doesn't continue, right? That's correct because the claimant's interpretation adjusts base case GDP by that precise ratio every single year, so it builds in that proportionality. Then he's referred to Dr. Boyter's second report, and he's asked, it's not your position, presumably, that that proportional relationship is some kind of coincidence. No, like I said, it's built in by the fact that you apply a fraction every year instead of only once. It's obviously deliberate, and the purpose is, as he says, isn't it? It's part of the counter-cyclical purpose of the securities, because nominal GDP is the closest thing there is to actual money that you can pay people with. I think it's totally unrelated with the counter-cyclical purpose because it's taking 1 year of base prices, and that would be proportionate to measuring the ratio in a different year of base prices, and that's unrelated to the capacity to pay of the country. Then he's asked, well, what do you say the purpose of the proportional link is? I don't find an economic purpose. You accept it's not a coincidence. You can't identify a purpose. Dr. Boyter does identify a purpose. The logical conclusion, isn't it, is that the purpose he's identified is the right one. I'm not sure I follow that logic, but I understand why it happens. Once you apply the fraction of GDP new base to GDP old base every year, you're building in, you're putting in that proportionality, also in the ratio of nominal GDP to the payment amount. So that's why it happens. Is it something I found an economic reason to make, valuable? I don't. So you can't identify a reason why there is this non-coincidental proportional relationship. I identify the reason I've told you. Mathematically, it's because you're applying the fraction every single year. That's the reason why the proportionality exists. Now, whether that proportionality was it telling me that it's relevant, I don't know. We measure again, we're measuring base years, in an economy that was very different in 1993 to what we would apply that measurement to what economy is in 2004. And then Mr. Barden says, Dr. Boyter offers the court a reason. He's been cross-examined on that, and the judge intervenes. In fact, what he actually says, it's likely to be positively correlated to the level of nominal GDP. So he's expressing an opinion as to likelihood. Would you agree with him that it is likely or not? I think the relationship between new base and old base is unpredictable, non-linear and unpredictable. So coincidental, is there likely to be some connection or correlation? And Doctor says it's not. I mean, the fact that this result on the proportionality that was mentioned, that is a result of applying the variable factor. So that's certainly not coincidental. It is done. But as to the economic significance of it, I think it's where Professor Boyter and I disagree. Mr. Barden continues, we understand that you disagree, but what I'm positing is that we agree that before rebasing, there is a proportional link. The claimant's interpretation maintains that link. The Republic's interpretation does not. We agree all of that as a matter of fact, don't we? No, it couldn't. It's not possible that before the rebasing, there is a proportional link, because before the rebasing, there is no data on the new year of base prices. But there is, because you can use the backcasted data to see it, which is what Professor Boyd has done, hasn't he? But you can only do that after the rebasing. You need to have data on 2004 base prices, to which Mr. Barden says, oh, of course, I totally understand that. But the fact is that one can do that, and that has been done. What it shows is that that relationship is, on the claimant's case, proportional before and after. On the Republic's case, it's proportional before, but not after. The question I'm asking you is just this: whether or not you think it's a good idea to maintain that relationship or not. That is something that, for the reasons Professor Boyd gives, a draftsperson could want to maintain. The answer is, well, there are a few parts in your question. I mean, once you have done the rebasing and you have data on the 2 base years, of course you can apply to any year you want. And you know it's a mathematical necessity that that equally will hold. So yes, I agree with that. As to the Republic's approach, my sense is, you know, it would not hold except in the overlap year, which is when we're applying the fraction. So neither going backwards nor going forwards, you would find that. And then the judge intervenes and matters move on. But what that passage shows, and I'm sorry to have taken the time reading it, but I
You
think
stop before the most entertaining part.
what the passage shows is accepted by the respondents that this only arises on a rebasing. The case that it's there before a rebasing is only because when you rebase, you backcast the rebased figures so that you have these 2 periods, or these 2 base years for the period both before and after rebasing. But it is a link that arises from the respondent's construction. And one of the difficulties about this is that there have been a number of quite complicated economic matters. One can see from the judgment that when you get to paragraph 224 of the judgment, the particular complexities in relation to this, unless stripped out, are quite easy to get mixed and confused. And that is what the judge did. There is the truism point, which we accept, which goes nowhere. There is this point, which we accept on the maths. But as Dr. Borenstein said, it doesn't really tell you anything of any economic significance, other than if you're applying a fraction each year, there's going to be a proportion, a different proportion each year. My Lords, my Lady, I think that is all I was going to say, but might I just check with others around me as to whether there are any other points I should be addressing? I'm very grateful, although Ms. Oppenheimer does have something to mention to the court, but not in the form of following.
Yes.
My Lords, my Lady, I've just been asked to address your Lordships on a direction that Lord Justice Phillips made following the handing down of his judgment in February, which followed the respondent's application for the imposition of a condition on the grant of permission of appeal. I don't know whether you have seen at the end of supplemental volume 4, there's a letter.
This was about breach of the embargo.
Yes, exactly, my Lords. And you may have seen the email from Lord Justice Phillips behind there, asking that we draw your Lordships and my Lady's attention to it to see if you wanted to make other arrangements for the hand down of the judgment or not.
No, I was going to mention the embargo. I had seen the letter and I was going to emphasise that the embargo means what it says. And when you get the draft in due course, it stays with you.
My Lord, may I make a comment on this new document? Because it is a new document and
Yes.
I don't have the right reply. But it's this. You'll see, and I think my Lord Mr. Justice Popplewell had this point. You see it stops at 2013 and does only the first 3 quarters of 2013. And that's when, of course, the Republic decided to stop publishing. So this document is no good for any later rebasing. And so then you have to do it twice. And I think the Lordship has got that point. And none of this is in the correct basket of goods. none of these choices from the securities. And with respect, the much easier route is to do what the securities require you to do, which is to carry on publishing 1993 data. And may I just give you also one reference, because Mr. Railton raised another new point. He took you to a part only of Mr. Boyter's evidence on base case GDP, and he ignored the full passage. And can I just give you the reference? It's supplemental core bundle. It's tab 7, it's page 148, and it's paragraph 20. Thank you.
Right. Well, it's a relatively short point we have to decide, but not an easy one, and there's obviously a lot of money at stake. So it will not surprise you to learn that we will take time to consider our decision. You will get draft judgments in the usual way, which is your chance to correct our English, but not our reasoning. As I mentioned a little earlier, the draft judgment comes with an embargo, which means what it says, and so the distribution must be very, very limited, particularly in circumstances in which this case no doubt is arousing a lot of public interest, not least in Argentina, where I understand that it was, the previous draft judgment was put into the public domain long before it should be. So the embargo is to be strictly respected. We would hope that in the light of the draft judgment you will be able to agree an order disposing of the appeal. If you can't agree a form of order, please make short written submissions and we will make the form of order that we consider to be appropriate. Thank you all very much for your interesting arguments.
All rise, good evening.